Bom, gente, hoje vamos tratar aqui do último capítulo do livro A República Tecnológica. Eu expliquei o que seria essa República Tecnológica, inclusive em um story, um shorts também, justamente para deixar de forma clara e para não restar dúvida do que se trata isso. E os autores fazem questão de continuar reafirmando esse conceito. Vamos para o capítulo 18? Vamos lá, então, para o capítulo número 18. Um ponto de vista estético. Em 1969, the series television Civilization, a monumental and ambitious account of art history from ancient Rome to medieval France and beyond, aired in the United Kingdom, captivating households across the country. More than 2 million people watched the program. Church services were rescheduled in some parishes to ensure that the show could be seen. The program's presenter, Kenneth Clark, born in 1903 in London, was the product of another age. Unapologetically aristocratic, he offered what appeared to be a coherent narrative of the march toward beauty and greatness of Western art. In post-war Britain as well as the US, his worldview was comforting to many and intentionally anachronistic. Clark's judgments about the merits of an artist's work or an epoch's aesthetic bounty had the force of legal edicts. The painting of 16th century Rome struck him as feeble-mannered and self-conscious. For Clark, there was high and low, and civilization was at where at least should be on a march towards something greater. He compared an African mask living in its country of origin, on the continent unspecified, with the Apollo Belvedere at the Vatican, concluding with characteristic assuredness that the Apollo embodies a higher state of civilization than the mask. Elsewhere, he declined, with a bracing dismissiveness, to provide Spain a central role in the history of Western civilization. Questioning what of a significance the country had done to enlarge the human mind and pull mankind a few steps up the hill. Clark represented, and his work continues to stake out a certain ideological pole. The view that sweeping aesthetic and nearly moral judgments could be made about entire cultures. Their sense of taste, capacity for innovation, ultimately contribution to human progress were all fair game for assessment and review. The public consumed his narrative but ultimately revolted. Clark and his series have been the subject of sustained attacks in the decades since the program's release. Mary Beard, a British author and historian, impressionante, eles colocam muitas referências aqui de autores nesse livro. Decades after first encountering the series, she had begun to feel decidedly uncomfortable with Clark's patrician self-confidence in the great man approach to art history, one damn genius after the next. So much of what Clark said could never be said today, but in our rush to rebel against the oppression of a narrow account of Western art and history, we perhaps deprived ourselves of more than we anticipated. The sweeping away of anachronisms such as Clark coincided with the abandonment of other normative and aesthetic frameworks. And we have, as a result, unwittingly diminished our capacity to discern and indeed to judge. Even modest attempts to invoke beauty today, such as swipe at a recent theatrical production by the columnist Peggy Noonan, outra referência, as ugly, bizarre, inartistic, are now fraught and resisted. The reshaping of art criticism, the challenges to Clark's mode of being, were the canary in the coal mine. Art might have been first, but much more was to follow. Taste and broader expressions of aesthetic preference, indeed, the suggestion of any preference at all in some contexts, have been shunned as divisive and mere expressions of elite sensibility. As Dave Denby wrote in an essay in The New Yorker in 1997, aesthetic taste now at risk of being dismissed as a mere product of status-seeking behavior. It's true, of course, that purportedly neutral or innocent aesthetic decisions are often means of constructing and maintaining caste hierarchies. Thorstein Veblen, an American sociologist, observed in 1899 that the circuitous driveways of the secluded country states of the British elite with their gratuitous curves were a means of expressing power. But is there anything but is there nothing in our aesthetic lives, no sense of north or surf that ought to be retained? Our collective and contemporary fear of making claims about truth, beauty, the good of life, and indeed justice have led us to the embrace of a thin version of collective identity, one that's incapable of providing meaningful direction to the human experience. Our cultures are now equal. Criticism and valid judgments are forbidden. Yet this new dogma glosses over the fact that certain cultures and indeed subcultures, including the norms and organizational habits of Silicon Valley, notwithstanding its flaws and contradictions, have produced wonders. Others have proven middling and worse, regressive and harmful. We are perhaps right to recall the summary abandonment of the unnamed African mask in favor of the white marble of the Apollo. But should we, inclusive o Francis Bacon, na verdade um autor escreve sobre a arte do Bacon, inclusive cita em algum momento sobre como que era a aparência, não é, do Bacon, que é um artista conhecido. E inclusive a própria casa dele está até hoje no Reino Unido. E aí ele é comparado a cabeça dele a Apolo, até o ponto que eu me lembro. Na verdade, a um white marble, não Apollo, mas um white marble. But should we be left with no means of discerning between art that moves us forward, ideas that advance humanity's cause, and those that don't? The risks that our fear to pronounce, to speak, to prefer has left us without direction, confidence when it comes to marshalling our shared resources and talents. Fear has led us to recoil and shrink our sense of the possible, and this fear has found its way into every aspect of our lives. This abandonment of aesthetic point of view is lethal to building tech. The construction of software requires taste both in crafting the programs involved and in selecting the personnel required to build them. It's as much as an art as it's a science. Silicon Valley has risen from a small patch of land in Santa Clara County and built so much and so quickly in part because it preserves space for the Clarks of the world. Founders have an aesthetic point of view. Their métier might not be the 19th century sculpture or Italian frescoes, but they found a space in the valley that permitted them to really exercise what's essentially an artistic form of judgment and to create in a world where normative claims about good and bad, narrative arcs of triumph and defeat were still permitted to exist. Aqui tem um quadro, né? Ulysses and the Sirens, by Herbert James Draper, de 1909. Tá mostrando aqui Ulysses me parece que é esse, e as Sirens. Ok, tá bom. The outperformers of the current moment, those who founded and built the world's largest technology companies, which in their size and influence now rival small countries, have largely walled themselves off from society in order to build. Their craft required insulation from the world, not immersion in it, as well as personal judgment and preference. The commitment to a single path or point of view and the limiting of one's options can sometimes be the most effective, indeed the only means of navigating the vicissitudes and pressures of public life. When Odysseus asked his crew to tie him to the mast of his ship as it sailed past the Sirens and their bewitching call, he warned his men, "If I should entreat you and bid you set me free, then with still more fetters bind me fast." He was intentionally restraining his own range of motion, his ability to respond to the outside world, and to risk of being diverted by its enchanting and indeed deadly temptation. A freedom of motion to maneuver at will can masquerade as an imitation of power. A willingness to constrain choice to cast oneself to the mast is often the best, if not only route to create creative production for either a company or a culture. Vamos aqui para o próximo tópico. The outperformance of founder-led companies for which there is a growing body of evidence is the result of this privileging of an aesthetic point of view, of space to pronounce and decide. Inclusive, isso aqui me lembrou a nova formatação do Google em São Paulo. Eles criaram um espaço novo bem legal da engenharia de software. Such economic outperformance has been deeply counterintuitive, including co-founding too many companies ruled by a committee with increased oversight and control over management should, according to the catechism of a free market, be more efficient and be more effective over time. Que faltou paralelismo. The evidence, however, suggests otherwise. Rüdiger Fallenbrach, a finance professor at Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland, compiled a list of likely 2,000 US companies over a 10-year period, of which 361 were run by a founder as opposed to a professional or appointed CEO. He found that an investment approach that purchased shares solely in companies run by founders would have earned an excess annual return of 10% or 4% more per year than a portfolio that included all companies founder run and otherwise, even when controlling for various other factors, including industry and the age of the business. Similar results, isso aqui é bom ler com atenção, tá? Olha aqui. Similar results had been observed with family-owned firms, but Fallenbrach's research helped distinguish the drivers behind the faster-than-average growth rates of companies that were controlled by single family from those that were run by that family as well. He concluded that a large ownership stake by descendants of a founding family alone was insufficient to affect a company's value on the market. It was rather firms that maintained the founder at the helm that reliably outperformed over time. Aqui mostra, né, the founder premium, total return of founder-led companies versus others. Aqui mostra, né, o crescimento das companhias. Aqui, outras companhias e aquelas que têm os fundadores no centro, cuidando delas. Claro, a pessoa que funda a empresa tem muito mais responsabilidade, muito mais paixão por aquilo que faz, né? Others have observed similar results. A group of researchers at Purdue University surveyed the 500, now S&P 500, an index of the largest and most significant businesses in America. Over a 10-year period from 1993 to 2003 to determine whether founder-led companies produce more innovation as measured by patents that was cited widely by others. The researchers were interested not in the mere filing of a patent application, but rather in patents that over the time came to be referenced repeatedly in academic journals and other publications. The team at Purdue found that companies led by founders as opposed to professional CEOs held a 31% higher number of significant patents. Esse número aqui é bem impressionante. Such outperformance is anything but an accident. The union of the pursuit of innovation with rigor of engineering execution requires a high degree of insulation from the outside world, some protection from the instincts and often misdirections of the market. É isso, né? Os fundadores geralmente vivem mais isolados do mundo real, do mercado, e acabam tendo paciência para desenvolver, não simplesmente seguir a manada, não é seguir o fluxo do mercado. Isso acaba criando produtos inovadores. Nothing much, inclusive tem uma frase muito interessante, não é? Que se uma empresa tiver apenas um pequeno grupo de clientes que são obcecados por um produto, de fato tem uma grande chance de construir uma startup, ao invés de pessoas que simplesmente usam, milhares de pessoas, né, usam aquele produto todos os dias de forma banal. Uma startup tem muito mais chance de prosperar, mesmo que uma só pessoa, né, levando mais ao extremo essa frase, use o produto e seja obcecado por aquele produto. Nothing much of substance and certainly nothing lasting will be created by committee. Our challenge both in the US and the West more broadly will be to harness and channel the creative energies of this new founding generation, these technical iconoclasts, into serving something more than their individual interests. An ownership culture must be allowed and encouraged to take root in our society. Outra citação, David Vincent, the former investment chief of Yale's endowment, was at the helm of the organization for 35 years. He spoke of investing the resources of the university, which was founded in 1701. Estou falando da Universidade de Yale, que foi fundada nesse ano, e, claro, uma das principais universidades compõe a Ivy League dos Estados Unidos. For Schwanz and Short, inclusive o MIT não faz parte da Ivy League, e isso é bem curioso. O MIT é um caso bem sui generis, tá? É um caso realmente bem sui generis. Mas Harvard faz parte, então quem está preocupado aí com Harvard, não fique. Harvard faz parte da Ivy League. Vamos continuar a leitura. For Schwensen, the short-termism the market's focus on quarter-to-quarter earnings are incredibly damaging, as he said in an interview in 2017. It's rather a sort of stewardship of the temporary and conditional ownership of an asset that allows one to preserve its value over the long term. One of the central advantages of Silicon Valley was its embrace, imperfect, halting, and full of contradictions, of an ownership society, a regime in which the labor, the creative talent within orgs, had a substantial stake in the success and outcomes of the businesses they were building. It's easy to forget that the act of granting equity to all employees at a tech company, from administrative assistants to executives, was a radical one. In the 1990s, departing from the prevailing model of hourly rates and salaries for an org staff while owners reaped outsized rewards, a handful of other industries had flirted with shared ownership models, from law firms to medical practices, but the significant equity stakes were in practice often limited to a thin swath of managers at the helm of an org. Silicon Valley went much farther, and the strategy proved essential to its success. Lembrando que o atual Vale do Silício tem mudado, né? Agora essas empresas estão indo para o Texas e para a Flórida, justamente para não pagar tanto imposto, justamente por causa da administração democrata. Many of the world's most prominent tech companies were essentially communally owned. The early participants shared in the risk and the reward. Silicon Valley early participants shared in the risk and the reward. Silicon Valley remains one of the few places in the world where individuals of low birth, to use a phrase of the constitutional law scholar Achille Reed R., can own something substantial and participate in the upside of their labor rather than remain cogs, even if often highly paid cogs in the ventures of another. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, a talented graduate could perhaps join Goldman Sachs, which was a pioneer of partnership compensation models, or perhaps a white-shoe law firm where attorneys shared the profits and risk of their work. But those experiments have essentially withered. Such firms still attract talented, ambitious minds, but they are paid salaries, often high ones, but salaries nonetheless. The upside of the endeavors and creative energy of labor is captured by the capitalists. In 1934, Ruth Benedict, inclusive ano de 34, foi o mesmo ano que o Vargas publicou a primeira Constituição da sua era. Ele publicaria uma somente depois de 3 anos, né, inaugurando o Estado Novo, mas daqui já é uma outra questão. Ruth Benedict published Patterns of Culture, in which she recounted her experience living with and studying pre-industrial communities in Western Canada, Melanesia, in the southwest of the U.S. She described working toward a more realistic social faith, one that accounted for the variation across human cultures and cultural practices. But she went farther as well, describing the coexistent and equally valid patterns of life which mankind has created for itself from the raw materials of existence. It was her reference to equally valid cultures that would prompt a century of discussion debate. For several generations of anthropologists, the study of pre-industrial societies became a means of elevating them, but also by extension unwittingly exempting them from the realm of moral scrutiny. Silicon Valley, in its modern form, was a product of this intellectual tradition of a cultural and moral agnosticism, if not relativism that assiduously avoided anything approaching substantive views about the good life. The effective altruism movement, which took hold in the Valley over the past decade and was advanced by the philosopher Peter Singer, among others, so to build on the intuitive appeal of ethical universalism, the view that all humans, and indeed some non-humans, should be considered in our moral calculus. The work of Singer, who was born in Melbourne, Australia, and taught at Princeton University, for more than 2 decades was attractive because it seemed to have solved the puzzle. Outra universidade da Ivy League. Well-being, whether of humans or see others, was all that mattered. But this approach provided cover for a generation to avoid more thorny questions about what constitutes a life well lived, the boundaries and content of national identity, and the human search for meaning. Roger Scruton, olha, outro autor famoso do conservadorismo britânico, a British philosopher, critiqued Singer for adopting a vacuous utilitarianism, whose elegance and simplicity, alluring as they were, nonetheless reduced experience to a single metric. Inclusive, o Roger Scruton também fala sobre essa questão estética dentro da própria visão conservadora, a ideia do belo também. The founders of many of the leading confirmed Silicon Valley were not immoral in this sense. They were simply amoral, skeptical of grand belief, em tese, liberais, grand belief structures and world views and affirmative conceptions of what a collective life could or ought to be. The entrepreneurs of Silicon Valley don't lack idealism. Indeed, they often appear to be brimming with it. But it's thin and can wither under even the slightest scrutiny. The legions of young founders have for decades now routinely claimed that they aspire to change the world. Yet such claims have grown meaningless from change the world. Yet such claims have grown meaningless from overuse. This cloak of idealism was put in order to believe these young founders of the need to develop anything approaching more substantial worldview. And the nation state itself, the most effective means of collective org in pursuit of a shared purpose that the world has ever known, was cast aside as an obstacle to progress. Leo Strauss, who was born in Prussia in the late 19th century and taught at the University of Chicago, argued that the rejection of the moral point of view was in many ways a precondition of the Enlightenment and indeed the scientific revolution that made Silicon Valley possible, writing that moral obtuseness, relinquishing, or at least pausing the search for a definition of good and evil is the necessary condition for scientific analysis. He was also early to observe that such a clean bifurcation of endeavors between the scientific and the moral was in practice far more difficult, that the value judgments which are forbidden to enter through the front door of political science, sociology, or economics enter these disciplines through the back door. For Strauss, the contemporary social scientist had rejected values in favor of a search for truth and convinced himself that such a distinction was possible. But 'twas this indifference to any goal or of aimlessness and drifting, as Strauss put it, that's the seed of our current nihilism as a culture. The legions of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and engineers were the successors to a previous generation of academics who had attempted to hide behind the purported neutral pursuit of scientific discovery. They enforced neutrality first in colleges and universities and later within the tech companies that have constructed the world within which we all now operate has left us with a hollow republic, something far short of that which we're now capable of building. But constructing a tech republic, a rich and thriving and raucously creative communal experiment, will require an embrace of value, virtue, and culture, the very things that the present generation was taught to abhor. For Lee Kuan Yew, the aspirational ideal was to become as Confucius urged more than 2,000 years ago, a junzi, which has been variously translated as an exemplary person or gentleman. This was someone who is loyal to his father and mother, faithful to his wife, brings up the children as well, and is a loyal citizen of his emperor. Lee said in an interview, such a specific conception of virtue for many today must be resisted as parochial and exclusionary. But what virtues, what conception of the noble or indeed exemplary life are willing to advance and defend in the place of the ones that have been jettisoned, discarded in the name of the inclusivity? Vamos lá, estamos terminando, gente. The fall of empires has been accompanied before by an abandonment of the pursuit and nurturing of virtue. Sallust, the Roman historian born in 1806, before the Common Era, chronicled the descent of the República down him. As Catiline attempted a coup, deve ser golpe de Estado essa palavra, a coup d'état na expressão em francês, and was later killed by the Roman army. Sallust wrote that as a result of riches, the youth were suddenly consumed with luxury and greed together with insolence. And they grew disinterested in anything beyond their own enrichment. Bom, para deixar vocês com gostinho de terminar, eu vou deixar que vocês mesmos consigam terminar aqui, então, essa leitura, que vai terminar aqui na página 252, tá? Bom, ficamos por aqui. Foi uma leitura realmente bem agradável da obra República Tecnológica. Espero vocês numa próxima leitura aqui do canal Diplomacia com Café e até o próximo episódio. Um abraço para cada um de vocês que acompanhou, de fato, a leitura até o final. Também para aqueles que começaram mais tarde nesta leitura.